What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Sports Lock Podcast. I am your host, Ben Mosteller, and today we will be breaking down the NFC North, talking about fantasy football here. We have completed the AFC with the North, South, East, and West. Now onto the NFC again, starting with the North. We will be telling you who you should be drafting, who you should be avoiding, and where I have these guys ranked. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, you're probably watching this crazy looking AI image. I've been using AI to make images for my cover photos, and this is probably the creepiest, craziest one yet. And if you're on Spotify, you probably can see it there as well. But that's all right. Give you a good laugh before we break down into the stats of fantasy football. But before we talk about this year, let's talk about last year. Last year, the standings were as follows: the Lions won at 12-5, the Packers 9-8, the Vikings 7-10, and the Bears also at 7-10. Where did I have them? I thought the Vikings were going to be a lot better. I had them in a whopping 13-4. They went 7-10. I then had the Lions in second at 10-7. They go 12-5, not far off there. The Bears, I had spot on at 7-10, although they finished fourth. I had them in third. And I was really harsh on the Packers last year, worse than I should have been. I had them at 4-13, but they did amazing last year, and I think that they're going to have a great year this year, and you'll see when we talk to them. But first, we're going to talk about the Chicago Bears. 7-10 last year, last in the division. Nothing new for the Bears to be last in their division. However, they make a lot of changes this year to the offense. First of all, they went out and drafted Caleb Williams out of USC with the first overall pick in the draft. They then got running back DeAndre Swift from Philadelphia to sign with them. They also signed wide receiver Keenan Allen from the Chargers. And they also drafted 9th overall from Washington, wide receiver Rome Odunze, who should also have great potential this year on this offense. But who's going to be the guy leading the charge? Well, that's going to be the first overall draft pick. We know Justin Fields is now with the Pittsburgh Steelers, so does Caleb Williams' team. Last year in college, 30 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. That's in college, though. How are you going to look in the NFL? And I think that's the biggest question here. I didn't think he had this most outstanding season when I saw him in games. I mean, 30-5 is great, but I didn't see him as like a clear number one overall pick. Now, he should succeed with this wide receiver core. We're going to talk about it in a minute. But when you get Rome and you bring in Keenan Allen to pair along with DJ Moore, you should succeed. It's going to be one of the better wide receiver cores in the league. But you have to be cautious with him as a rookie. Is he going to run the ball a lot? Probably not. And that is where in fantasy there's a big difference, because if you get a quarterback that can run the ball like an Anthony Richardson, you're going to take him. Now, maybe Caleb Williams is a better pocket passer, but will he perform better in fantasy? It's really hard to tell. So in his first season behind that line in the NFL, I don't see him doing anything crazy. I think that ESPN has him way too high at QB 13. I have the whole way down at QB 22, which I think is going to bring a lot of questions to some people of why. But I just don't put him over guys that are proven. You know, Jared Goff is behind him. Kirk Cousins is behind him. I know these are older guys, but, you know, even in some leagues, you have Joe Burrow going behind him. You have Daniels that's going right around him. That's another rookie. I just go with these proven guys first before the rookie. So with that being said, he's a lot lower on my list. I think right at QB 13 is his top ceiling where ESPN has him. That's not where you should really be drafting guys. You want them to have a bigger ceiling. Running back DeAndre Swift finished with his first 1,000-yard rushing season of his career. He also added 6 total touchdowns. He had some pretty big games last year, but then kind of was just but I think he should see similar numbers here in Chicago this upcoming season. I don't think it's going to be anything too flashy, especially in PPR. But I do think that he'll just be a normal guy to get the job done. So not really a high floor or ceiling. He's just kind of there. So for me, he's my RB22. I agree with ESPN RB22. I think if you can snag him somewhere in the 4th round or so, it'd be solid. for a guy like DeAndre Swift as possibly more of a low RB2, I feel like, but an RB2 nonetheless. So I like other guys that I'd be targeting in my RB2 around him, or even my RB3. But Swift, he's just going to do the job. I don't think he's going to be a surprising top 10 RB this year in fantasy, but I also don't think he's going to be like an RB 30. So I think he's a pretty safe pick at his ADP. But usually you want to go for a little bit more upside around that value, where I kind of see some other guys such as like a Zamir White. So let's talk about those wide receivers. DJ Moore, of course, coming back for his second year, wide receiver 6. He surprised a lot of people last year. I was glad to have him on one of my fantasy teams. I actually paired him with Keenan Allen. Now they're together, which is crazy. I had Keenan Allen, Tyreek Hill, and DJ Moore. Don't ask me how I did it, but it was phenomenal. But anyways, DJ Moore was the wide receiver 6, 96 receptions, 1,364 yards, which was 6th best amongst wide receivers, and 8 touchdowns, which was tied for 4th. Then you had Keenan Allen, who finished 2 spots behind him with 108 receptions, which was 4th best amongst wide receivers, over 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns, which was tied for 5th amongst wide receivers. Then you had Rome Odunze, who finished last year with 92 receptions, 1,600 yards, and 13 touchdowns for Washington. What a wide receiver core. If you would put any other quarterback there besides a rookie, they would be a top 5 quarterback, and I think that's why ESPN has him higher than I do. But again, I'm not sold on Caleb Williams quite yet. So where do I have them? Well, DJ Moore, I have him as my wide receiver 19. I do think he's still the slight favorite over Keenan Allen, just because he's been in that offense. I know it's a new wide receiver, a new quarterback there, and he could connect with any of the 3. But for now, I'll go with the guy that's been there and knows the offense. Keenan Allen, I have him as my wide receiver 28, ESPN wide receiver 31. And Rome Odunze, I put him a little bit further back as my wide receiver 52, just because it's going to be hard for Caleb Williams to be able to have all 3 guys produce and be pretty equal. And you have another rookie coming in. I think he'll just be maybe a 3-4 touchdown guy this year. So I have Rome a little bit lower than some other guys, ESPN wide receiver 43. Tight end Cole Kmet, great year last year. Tight end 8, 73 receptions, tied 6th amongst tight ends, 719 yards and 6 touchdowns, which was tied for 2nd best. So a great breakout year for Cole Kmet. He's talented, but again, you have so much talent on this offense right now and a rookie quarterback. Where do the targets go? I don't think he gets close to 73 receptions. I think he's more of a 4 touchdown guy this year. With that being said, he's my tight end 18, ESPN tight end 15. I just think it's going to, again, be hard for Caleb Williams to be able to feed everybody in this offense. Defense's top 20, they're kind of average. They need to improve on that, but they did improve on the offense. So how are they going to do this year? I do think they go not 8 and 9. I do think they have potential, obviously, to finish by 500, but I don't see them taking that huge jump from like a 7-win team to a 12-win team. Or even a 10-11 win team. I think 8 or 9 wins is where they're at. I'm putting them at 8 and 9 based off of their schedule. The Detroit Lions, one of the teams I always root for in the NFL, even though I am a Steeler and Seahawk fan, the Lions are up there. 12-5 last year, first in the division. This was their best record since 1991. Unfortunately, they lost in the conference championship to San Fran 34-31, which really hurt there. I was really hoping they would win. They got off to that fast start and just couldn't do it. I would have loved to have seen the rematch of the Lions and the Chiefs, which we got earlier in the season last year. Key additions, though, nobody really to talk about. It's going to be a lot of guys that they're bringing back, trying to upgrade on the defense. And one of those guys coming back is Jared Goff, who was QB7 with 4,575 yards, which was 2nd best amongst quarterbacks last year, 30 touchdowns, which was 4th best, and 12 interceptions. He will be going into his 9th season, and last year was his 2nd best season on paper. I think he's going to have another great year. Again, nothing's really changed. They do lose a wide receiver, but they still have one of the best wide receivers in the game and an amazing tight end, and also an amazing running back core. So maybe the touchdowns drop off slightly, but this is where I'm getting at Kalen Williams. Jared Goff is a proven guy, finished QB7. Again, nothing flashy. He's not a running quarterback. But they have him as QB21. I just don't see how he is that bad when he was QB7 last year. What's going to be the huge drop? I just don't see a huge drop. His favorite targets are still there. So for me, he's up to QB13. For me, I think he's a big sleeper at his ADP. Am I thrilled to have Jared Goff as a starter? I'm not taking him as a starter, but as a backup, he's a guy I think you could wait on pretty late. I'm sure there's some flashier guys there that you might want to take a risk on, but if you get a top quarterback and Goff's available at QB21, I mean, I would take him as a solid backup for sure. So I think he's a guy you monitor to get as a backup. And honestly, he might even fall to a waiver wire spot. We don't know that. It depends on the guys you're drafting with. Let's talk about the dynamic duo of David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. Last year, Gibbs finished RB10, 945 yards, 11 total touchdowns. Montgomery finished RB17 with over 1,000 yards, 13 touchdowns, which was tied for third. Obviously, Gibbs used more in the PPR leagues, which is why he was higher in PPR than Montgomery, but vice versa, non-PPR for Montgomery. This year, both running backs, I think they're going to be used again. I don't think there's going to be one over the other. Both did amazing. Why go away from it? And right now, I think Montgomery is still the starter. But Gibbs has a little bit more upside in PPR leagues. I think they're a little bit too high on him. They have him as the RB6. I don't think he's going to be a 13, 15 touchdown guy. I think he stays around what he did last year. So for me, he's my RB11. Montgomery's my RB23, which is where ESPN has him. So I'm not taking Gibbs as a top 10 running back in fantasy this year. But some people are. I do like other guys in front of him that have more potential that are the starters, like a Travis Etienne. But Gibbs is still a solid running back, and so is Montgomery. So now let's talk about one of my favorite players in the NFL, if not my favorite player in the NFL, Amon-Ra St. Brown. I loved Amon-Ra St. Brown when he came into the NFL. I drafted him in his rookie year thinking that he would do amazing, and he did. And then the following year, I said, he's going to pop off. Last year, I was like, he's popping off. I forget where ESPN had him ranked. I think it maybe was in the teens, but I was a lot higher on Amon-Ra. I just love what he provided. I thought that he would take the step up. And when you find a guy in fantasy like that is your guy, you stick with him and you support him. So that's me with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Going back to last year, I think, again, I had him as my wide receiver 8. Obviously, he did a lot better at 3. But he is my guy. And he had an amazing year last year. 119 receptions, tied second with Tyreek Hill, over 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns. I mean, those are the clear dynamic trio of Lamb, Hill, and Brown. Now, I do favor Lamb over Tyreek, and Tyreek a little bit over Amon-Ra, but Amon-Ra and Tyreek are a lot closer. I think Amon-Ra is a little bit more safe of a pick than Tyreek, but I love them both. So if CeeDee's off the board and you take Amon-Ra over Tyreek, I wouldn't be upset about that. For this year, again, such a safe pick. He's my wide receiver 3 again. ESPN wide receiver 4. They like Jamar Chase a little bit more. But I'm an Amon-Ra guy. I have him at the 3, and I do think the best 3 receivers are Lamb, Hill, and Amon-Ra this year. And they brought nobody in Detroit to change that or to compete with Amon-Ra for targets. Obviously, Laporta will get targets and Gibbs will get targets, but otherwise it's all going to go to Amon-Ra St. Brown. Tight end Sam Laporta put up an amazing rookie season. Tight end 1. How about that? That's very hard to say that a rookie comes in and takes tight end 1. It might never have been done. But 86 receptions, 889 yards, and 10 touchdowns. I do think the touchdowns drop slightly, but I do think he gets roughly about the same amount of receptions just because, again, the targets are Amon-Ra and Sam Laporta. For me, I do have Kelsey a little bit over him. Kelsey missed some time, and he's just been a proven guy. But I think either or Laporta or Kelsey, you can't go wrong. The defense needs improved. That's what's transforming them to being a dominant force in the NFL. Their offense is incredible. Defense needs some work. Hopefully, the draft helps them there. Last year they go 12-5, projected 10-7. I'm gonna go 11-6. They do have a tougher schedule since they finished first in the division. I think that's really fair at 11-6 for this Detroit team, but definitely a team that'll be looking to go back to the playoffs. And not only there, they were 3 points away from the Super Bowl, so trying to get back there. Let's talk about the Green Bay Packers, who I was really low on last year, which was a mistake. But they went 9-8, second in the division. They lost to San Fran in the divisional round by 3, so we almost had a Packers-Lions divisional matchup in the championship. Their key additions, they add Josh Jacobs. They lose Aaron Jones, but they do pick up Josh Jacobs. Talk about Jordan Love. Shocked the nation last year. 4,159 yards, 32 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. His touchdowns were among the top of quarterbacks last year. He also added 4 rushing touchdowns, so he had a little upside there with the rushing game. Also, something to note that I think is really positive is that in his last 8 games, he had 18 touchdowns to 1 interception. So he was on pace again for about 36 touchdowns and 2 interceptions if in the last part of the season. I think Love continues to improve. QB 5 last year, and this year they have him at QB 10. I do think he finishes a little bit in between there. He does have top 5 potential again, but guys like Joe Burrow are coming back. I think Patrick Mahomes is going to be a little bit better with some of his additions we talked about last week. So that's why he's not a little bit higher for me, but he's my QB 8. And again, I think that's pretty safe at QB 8, a little bit better than ESPN has. I would love to target Jordan Love. I'm not one of those guys that jumps out early when good wide receivers or running backs are still on the board, or even tight ends. I wait to get those positions before quarterback. I don't think Love's going to be a guy that's just jumping off the paper or for some people in fantasy leagues. So if you're in a 10-man league, if you draft him, or even a 12-man league, you have a good chance of getting him at the back half of the draft while everybody gets the top guys. I like the upside of Love, and he's a guy that I'll try to be targeting in fantasy this year based off of my draft style. Running back Josh Jacobs had a down year last year for the Raiders, RB 28, 805 yards and 6 touchdowns. This was, of course, after the year prior. He finishes the RB 3 with over 1,600 yards and 12 touchdowns. Now, we know Green Bay loves using multiple running backs. They added Marshawn Lloyd in the draft. They also, of course, have A.J. Dillon, who had a rough year last year. But I don't think it's going to be all Josh Jacobs. But with that being said, the Packers have always been able to support a top 20 running back in fantasy besides last year with injuries. They've been able to do that with Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, sometimes even both of them finishing in the top 20. So I think that there is a lower floor on Jacobs, but there also is a pretty high ceiling that he could bust out to his RB3 numbers. I don't think he's going to get there, but I also don't think he's going to have such of that low floor where he's like an RB30. Sounds pretty familiar with a guy named DeAndre Swift I just talked about. I think it's the same thing there. So he's my RB16, ESPN RB16. I think you got to watch for Lloyd and Dillon. More so Lloyd's upside, I think, especially on the waiver wire if Jacobs were to get hurt. But I do like Josh Jacobs, but again, not a guy kind of like a Swift where I'm like, oh, I'm targeting Josh Jacobs. Another good wide receiver trio here with Watson, Dobbs, and Jaden Reed. Very close last year. And I thought these numbers were interesting when I'll get to them here in a second. All 3 wide receivers impacted the game. Reed, who is listed as their wide receiver 3, ended up as their best wide receiver last year. Wide receiver 25 with 64 receptions, 793 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Romeo Dobbs, who's her wide receiver 2, finished wide receiver 36 with 59 receptions, 674 yards, and also 8 touchdowns. And then Christian Watson finished wide receiver 64. He did only play 9 games as a starter, 28 receptions, 422 yards, and 5 touchdowns. If healthy, he was on pace to finish as a wide receiver 26, right behind Jaden Reed. And arguably, if he was healthy, he probably would have done better than Jaden Reed. But you take a look at these numbers, and all these wide receivers practically had the same numbers last year. Love was able to support that, which is phenomenal. Which means, who do you pick? I don't think you go wrong with picking any of them. And that's going to be the tough part because ADP-wise, they're all pretty close. Currently, Romeo Doubs is the worst. ESPN has him as wide receiver 61. I think he's more around wide receiver 51. But Dobbs could easily be the number one target getter. Right now, they think it's Jaden Reed. I have him as my wide receiver 38, ESPN wide receiver 34. We more agree so on Watson, wide receiver 39 to ESPN's wide receiver 39. I do slightly favor Christian Watson over any of these guys at his ADP. So I would target him over Reed or Dobbs just because I think he has more of an upside with his size. And I think he'll be targeted a lot more than the other two, especially listed as the wide receiver 1. But just a great wide receiver core, and you have a quarterback that can support them all, which means he will do pretty well. Finally, we do have Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft as the tight ends. Musgrave finished tight end 29, 34 receptions, 352 yards, and 1 touchdown in 11 games. He was on pace to finish as a tight end 18 if he did play all the games. But obviously, he filled in for Tucker Kraft, who also I think is going to be in the mix here for targets. But they're going to be hard to come by, kind of like a Cole Kmet situation in Chicago. So for me, I'm staying away from both because you have such a great wide receiver core. But he's my tight end 23, ESPN tight end 23, where Kraft is my tight end 28. ESPN also has him a little bit lower than that. Their defense is bad. Kind of like the Lions, high power offense, bad defense. So what do they do this year? I do think they improve. I think they are also an 11-16. I do think Detroit gets the nod as far as winning the division, but Green Bay will compete. And I will say this right now, I will not be shocked if Green Bay wins that division this year. I was hard on them last year. I'm not going to be hard on them this year. They've proven to be a great team under Jordan Love and this offense. So hopefully they can get the defense going, and if so, they will be a team to dominate with, not just in the NFC, but in the NFL. Lastly, we have the Minnesota Vikings, 7-10 last year, which was third in the division in their worst season since 2013. They do lose Kirk Cousins there, but they do add quarterback Sam Darnold from the 49ers. They draft J.J. McCarthy out of Michigan with the 10th overall pick, and they add running back Aaron Jones, division rival from the Packers. Now, what I'm reading is Sam Darnold is likely to be the starter, but they will give McCarthy some reps in training camp to have a chance to start. They are liking Sam Darnold. Last year, he only got 1 start in his last game of the season, 189 yards, 1 touchdown. Now, I'm not really fond of either quarterback. I know they have an amazing wide receiver in Justin Jefferson and also the rookie last year, Jordan Addison. However, I just am not really sold on any of these guys to have fantasy upside. For me, I would probably take more of a risk on McCarthy, just because if Darnold starts off slow, they'll go to him early. But I'm staying away from either. They're both around my QB 30. I have them about QB 29, whoever the starter may be. So not a guy that I'm drafting. Aaron Jones comes in. It's always been a consistent running back. Unfortunately, last year, due to the injury, only 11 games. Finished RB 37, 3 total touchdowns, 656 yards. But Jones, he's a 6 to 8 touchdown type guy. I think he'll be closer to 1,000 yards, of course, if he stays healthy, which puts him as my RB 18, ESPN RB 19. I do think that when I come out with my rankings at the end of the season, Jones might be a guy I might push up a little bit. But I was high on a guy last year there, in Alexander Madison, and he did not perform at all. So it's just really hard to say what they'll do in this Vikings offense with this new quarterback, whoever it may be. But Jones, again, I don't think that I think he's not really a guy that's going to be a top 10 running back, but he's not going to be a guy that's like a RB 40. So if you look at it that way, I think he's pretty close around the RB 20 mark. Wide receivers, Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. Now, Jefferson, unfortunately, was hurt last year. I did have number 1 overall pick. I did take Justin Jefferson, and that hurt me. It cost me my season pretty much. But in his 9 games, he had 68 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 5 touchdowns. What's insane was he was on pace to finish with the same amount of receptions the year prior, 128. He was to surpass over 2,000 receiving yards and 10 touchdowns, which would have easily put him as a wide receiver 1. Now, Jordan Addison, wide receiver 23, is a rookie. Great season, 70 receptions, 911 yards, and 10 touchdowns, which was tied for 3rd. Now, there's a question. How are they going to do with these new quarterbacks at the helm, Sam Darnold or J.J. McCarthy? I think Jefferson, because he has to be the guy and take over, will still be a top 10 wide receiver. He's my wide receiver 5, ESPN wide receiver 5. He's just a talent, and they're going to find a way to get him the ball. But where that's going to hurt is Jordan Addison, and that's why he is the whole way down at wide receiver 40 for me, ESPN wide receiver 41. And you got other mouths to feed there, and I think Addison's going to be the one to hurt. One of the mouths to feed is TJ Hawkinson, who had an amazing season, tight end 4, 95 receptions, which was second best amongst tight ends. Of course, Sam Laporta was right in front of him, 960 yards, 5 touchdowns. I do think the quarterback downgrade will hurt Hawkinson to not be a top 10 tight end, especially not a top 5. He's my tight end 11, as well as ESPN tight end 11. The defense is average. They still have an amazing running back and a great wide receiver core. Just how will the quarterback connect with them? And I think it's very similar to what's in Chicago. But last year they go 7-10. I don't know how they get better with this quarterback core coming in. I think they get worse, and I have them at 4-13. Crazy how last year I projected 13-4, and now I'm saying 4-13. So let's take a look at some potential sleepers and busts. I talked about Jared Goff. I just see him no way being a QB 21, especially when he's been so consistent right around the QB 11-12 mark, and even last year doing QB 7. I also think Romeo Doubs is a big sleeper. They're saying wide receiver 61, not really even getting drafted in most cases. I think that Romeo Doubs has a potential, like last year, to at least be a wide receiver 35 or higher. And a bust for me is Caleb Williams. They have him as the QB 13. I'm just not sold on him yet. Maybe after preseason, I'll adjust my rankings to move him a little bit higher. I hope I would with that wide receiver core and team. However, for now, not seeing him play, to have him there, I just don't like it. And again, the standings, I have the Lions and Packers at both 11-6, the Bears at 8-9, and the Vikings dropping to a whopping 4-13. That's the podcast for this week. Thanks for listening in, guys. And if you're listening on Spotify, I appreciate it because we're just kicking it off over there now with this season. But if you're not, follow me on YouTube, subscribe there, follow me on TikTok and Instagram. I really appreciate the love and support. And hopefully I'll be posting another video this week because I forgot to post this one last week prior to me going to Vegas next week. And if not, it'll come the week prior with the NFC South. So thanks for listening in. Appreciate it. Have a good one. Enjoy your day.